Games are an art form. I think that's become a lot more clear over the last few decades or so. But the unique thing about video games are how there's certain types of games and certain types of players who won't actively be looking for things that would generally be thought of as holding artistic merit. What I'm referring to is mostly in relation to the technical side of video game creation. I wouldn't personally say there's any artistic merit in how a certain piece of code has been written, or how a gameplay mechanic has been implemented, although I'm sure some people might disagree with me on that. However, when it comes down to what I'm personally looking for in a game, I think it primarily comes down to uniqueness. And not just that, a uniqueness that can only really be achieved effectively using the video game format. And that's why today we're going to be taking a look at a collection of games from a developer who, despite having all the correct ingredients to create a boom amongst the indie scene, hasn't seemed to yet capture the imagination of a wider audience. That being Jeremy Couillard, one of the most standout and unique voices I've witnessed in the video game scene for quite a while. We're going to be looking at his last 3 games, those being Jeff, Fuzz Dungeon, and Escape from Lavender Island. And as you can see from all 3 of their cover arts, you can tell straight away these aren't going to be the most conventional experiences in the world. But the most important distinction we have to make with these 3 games are that they're all very self-aware of what they are. From what I perceived while playing them, it appears Jeremy is oftentimes very aware at the somewhat amateurish nature of many decisions that are taken during the course of these games. However, that's not to say these decisions are unintentional or ill thought out either. The closest comparisons I can give are films like Inland Empire, or some of the early computer art we saw from artists like Bugzinski. Despite the shortcomings which come from experimenting with a new, fairly untapped medium, there's still a very distinct, clear voice that shines through. And coming into our first game, Jeff, that can be felt almost immediately. Bizarre and surreal are the 2 words that played in my mind for the vast majority of my time spent with all these games, but in the best way possible. The art style and character designs become distinct within a very short amount of time, and that's something I love about Jeremy's work. There's too many video games, specifically those in the shooter category, that just appear so grey and generic. So being given control of some purple alien in the middle of some strange abstract space with balls zipping around everywhere, I had a feeling I was in for something interesting, to say the very least. And this bizarre only continues when jumping down and interacting with the other aliens. The amount of contrasting styles and tones in relation to all facets, offsetting the atmosphere completely. For example, the music to begin with starts as this strange ambient drone before switching to something you'd hear in a wildlife documentary. You should be able to see what I meant about that amateurish feel of the game at this point. Animations that look like they're from a library of stock ones, janky controls, just an overall lack of polish all round. But understand, it's this kind of stuff that I personally think leads way to the unconventional, bold decisions that we witness in these games. We can tell immediately this is a game with a very low budget, so in turn, Jeremy seems to turn to his own creativity to make up for the rather broad tools he's working with. This game's made in the Unreal Engine, for example, and I'm sure many of you could have noticed that purely on the basis of how the game looks. Lots of people were able to make tons of garbage in the Unreal Engine due to how accessible it is, with this game lying somewhere in the middle of self-aware garbage and genuinely intriguing. See, things like this alone can leave more of an impact on me than any big budget AAA game that's come out in the past few years. Yeah, it's random, and yeah, it doesn't really mean anything, but it's striking, and sometimes that's all that really counts. I definitely started getting this uneasy feeling as I continue my journey through this game, with the developer being so unknown, and the game already appearing to throw the rulebook out the window. It leaves the player almost completely out in the cold, another trait of Jeremy's work that I find to be very effective. There's no conventions that I can really relate to this game as of yet, so I'm not really sure where it's going to take me. Reaching the top of this structure, we end up getting chewed up and spit out by the universe. This being one of the first pieces of social commentary that remains omnipresent throughout Jeremy's games, one never being shoved in your face either. This is still a game called Jeff after all. Taking itself too seriously at any point would have just been a bit too ridiculous, to be honest. One drug trip through the universe later, we arrive at Skullgajar City, a place featuring even more bizarre creatures and things to be looked at in almost every single frame. This is something else that's achieved very effectively in Jeremy's games, where despite having a unique voice, he's able to apply his style to a variety of artistic approaches. The opening area was rather sparse and ambient, whereas the one we've been transported to now was one of the most overwhelming environments I've ever seen in the game. I love it, it actively rewards the player when taking a close look at their surroundings. There always appears to be something to find, and again, that's the benefit of resource management. With this game clearly not aiming to be realistic, and in some ways functional, more time is able to be spent on the overall direction of the art, what I perceive as the most important factor of these games. Trees with purple and blue stripes covering them, what appears to be hand-drawn backdrops, UFOs flying in the air. There's a real feel of childlike wonder I get from this game, and in a very raw kind of way. There's no restrictions that are being applied. It's like every single idea, every thought in Jeremy's mind has been captured and translated to the video game format, with the result being a world where there's almost always something interesting to observe. This is pretty much what I think of when thinking of games as an art form. We can almost visualize the playzone Jeremy's working with as a canvas, and this being the result after he built it up over time. One epic scooter ride later, we're transitioned to the Earth itself, where we start getting the first hints of self-reflection in Jeremy's games. First, from the image that I'm sure most of us can relate to of quietly sitting in the middle of the night glaring at your phone in the darkness. And then, when being taken to Hota Furnishing, that standing for hatred of the rich, we get the first taste of Jeremy's focus on classism, and what appears to be his absolute hate for those in positions of power with absurd amounts of wealth.
Hota Home Furnishing is the only furniture store with 100% former millionaire assembled furniture. Our alien family-owned showroom serves as a re-education and labor camp for some of Earth's most formerly wealthy citizens. We have our prisoners elegantly assemble old flat-packed furniture all day, so you don't have to.
The aliens we've been seeing are very much still here, despite being on Earth. And as we wander around the furniture store trying to find a lamp, I'd argue the environment is still very much unnerving, the only thing that really offsets that being the whimsical music we hear in the back. We see fully grown businessmen kicking their legs like school kids, some kind of blue horseman sitting in a bath, and I don't even know what's going on here. During a brief interlude where we collect orbs out in space, we hear in the back an all-out word babble, categorizing events that could ultimately mean anything if you analyze them close enough.
I went there to visit, and there was a mysterious clawfoot bathtub in the living room, filled with cold, dirty water. It smelled like wet wood and open beer cans. Everyone was drinking whiskey out of a plastic bottle and talking about ancient Babylon.
This being yet another staple of Jeremy's games, a literary version of the unfiltered regurgitation of ideas that we see in regards to the artistic style of his games. And upon acquiring our lamp, we finally go to a doctor to try and find out what our name means. The doctor in question being a certain Jacobo Grinberg, a real-life doctor who mysteriously disappeared in the 1990s, with many people theorizing it had something to do with his work in relation to the holographic matrix, perhaps being kidnapped by certain governmental forces due to their interest in his research. Don't worry though, he turns out to be right here apparently, with the final section of this game showing us defeating all of our worst demons, like staying in all weekend, leaving leaving projects incomplete. Again, all stuff that will be quite relatable to many people, and perhaps somewhat more impactful due to the insanity that makes up the majority of this game. There's nothing I'd truly describe in this game as outright ominous, but it's definitely off-kilter the whole way through. So when being chased through Depression Dungeon or Anxiety Alley, and having situations be relayed at the bottom of the screen that many can relate to, it can hit quite hard at points.
You are on a cloud. Up ahead is an altar. Approach the altar and sit on its cloud throne. It is going to take you on a journey through varying densities of consciousness until the most lightweight level unwraps itself before you.
We have one last existential ascent after this, the voice in the background giving a Fight Club-esque narration about the dangers of consumerism and the monotonous cycle of life.
At night, I stream vapid television shows and engorge myself on processed foods. I pull my shirt above my gut and let it air out. I rest the TV controller upon it. I feel like my mouth is a black hole that subsumes everything around it. My home orbits around my black hole mouth and sucks up thousands and thousands of dollars of consumer products that I am coerced into thinking that I need.
And with that, we find out what our name means, a statement pertaining to one's self-realization, and then reach the end of the game. Let's not slow down the weirdness train, however, as we jump right from Jeff into the equally bizarre Fuzz Dungeon, putting us in the shoes, or I guess heels, of some strange dog woman wearing a vest, jeans, and high heels. This game almost leads in perfectly from the finale of Jeff, with Jeremy's self-reflection once again shining through immediately. We're made to type out a brief paragraph that defines the Fuzz Dungeon as a place where something thought of in your mind becomes reality. This quite obviously pertains to Jeremy's process entirely when it comes to creating a game, as we saw with Jeff. The final line to me is the one that I paid attention to the most as someone who creates myself. An entire 2 years of a life turns into a video game that costs $3.99 on the internet. We put all of our effort into doing the things we love, and in Jeremy's case, he spent 2 years developing an original artistic vision in game form, and goes on to sell that for less than a meal at a fast food place. Fuzz Dungeon itself is a lot more structured than Jeff was. Whereas Jeff conveyed an odyssey pertaining to the self, Fuzz Dungeon to me appears to at times be a slow meditation on the idea of life at large, and other times purely being an even more surrealistic delve into abstraction. Fuzz Dungeon divides itself into stages, starting off with a side-scroller and some kind of prehistoric jungle landscape, collecting bones along the way. Where upon completing it, we're given ground. That's it, ground. And that's the start of our journey with this game, with us going through all these different stages, constructing a kind of reality. The threads that we see tying all these things together being what I see as a quite literal representation of what ties everything together in our reality. That being DNA, atoms, the particles and molecules that make up quite literally everything.
An independent journalist opened up a document on his computer and began to compose his next podcast. He decided the theme would be about the Sankabetsu brown bear incident in Japan in 1915. A group of settlers in Hokkaido were attacked by a giant brown bear that was rudely awoken from its hibernation.
This continues in one of the next stages, where we're made to essentially create life. First, creating food, and then creating and feeding humans with that food. A really strange first-person stage follows after this, containing several different puzzles, quite a few revolving around these weird Meat Boy guys that run around. The music in the background being freaky, and the layout being disorientating, but having whatever message this is trying to convey be totally lost on me. And that seems to be the case for a lot of these minigames, to be honest. I think compared to Jeff, Fuzz Dungeon is much more of an art showcase, which is fine, obviously.
I don't know. I've been going to other buildings and exploring.
You've been in other buildings.
That's not to say all of these minigames should be written off as meaningless, however, as can be seen from the one that takes the form of a top-down 2D pixel game, being asked a series of questions akin to one a therapist might ask you. Ones revolved around your work, your behaviour, what's causing negative thoughts, and so on. In these moments, as well as the minigame that takes place in the apartment later on, Jeremy appears to show a strong aversion to both the healthcare system in America, as can be seen with how ineffective and limited their crisis counsellors are, with all of this questioning leading to a prescription of Xanax, instead of being given the tools to help ourselves. And also somewhat of an aversion to the idea of therapy entirely, as we hear from the AI voice in the apartment.
My psychological growth is stilted, just my gut keeps growing. When I get drinks with friends they tell me I should do therapy. I told my mom I'm a communist and she told me I need to do therapy. The world feels like it's falling apart. It feels like everyone is losing interest. Why do I have to do therapy? CEOs should do therapy. People who own yachts and multiple properties across the world should do therapy.
Reflecting the mind of someone lamenting the state they find themselves in, keeping their mindset stuck in a place where they felt the most fulfilled, feeling inferior when comparing themselves to their peers, thinking therapy should only be meant for a certain kind of person, and finding it unfair that average people need to attend such a thing.
I don't really know what I'm doing with my life.
Moments like the apartment yet again prove this isn't all just random junk slapped together. The way this whole section is pieced together, with the music that escalates after the voice is done talking, it's some really powerful stuff. And these more personal feelings that are being expressed occur even more in other minigames, like the one where we climb up a tower, with the coins cleverly revealing lines of dialogue as you pick up each one.
Ideas are not coming to me. I'm starting to not believe in them anymore. I cannot precisely express what I feel.
The message here, yet again, appearing to relate to the struggles of life simply becoming too much, having things like financial concerns get in the way of someone's creativity, resulting in them creating things they're not satisfied with, or perhaps not even being able to create anything at all. And upon completing all of these mini-games and acquiring all the pieces to create our world, we get taken to the Fuzz suburbs, with a giant Sasquatch statue giving us 3 challenges. Sasquatch being a figure who actually gets brought up several times throughout the game, with me once again not really understanding why that even is. These challenges consist of riding on cars for 30 seconds, hiding away bodies, and then getting ourselves run over, all being accompanied by an absolutely phenomenal track. This takes us to some gigantic rave made up of workers in masks, allowing us to get one of 3 endings, the first of which having us nuke the crowd and promptly crashing the game. The second having us return back to the office at the start, and the third having you break out some moves and stay where the party's at. While not being the same kind of journey Jeff was, there's still so much to see with Fuzz Dungeon. It's got just as strong an artistic vision, and despite the more individualized nature of all the mini-games here, still presents some really clear and strong themes in a striking way. That takes us to the last of these 3 games, this one also being Jeremy's most recent, and in my opinion, most ambitious work at the time of making this video, Escape from Lavender Island. The first thing you'd likely notice coming off the back of the last 2 games is the quite significant style switch up, ditching the Unreal Engine's over-the-top blue, motion blurry, overly reflective type effect, and instead going for a rather trendy PS1 nostalgia look, similar to a game like Cruelty Squad. We start the game off in a prison, and after eventually finding our way out, it's not long until we start running into the same kinds of twisted creatures that we've been seeing in the previous games.
Where's the meat and the meat body comes walking back line and back.
This game takes on quite a different structure as well. Jeff presented a kind of Odyssey adventure, Fuzz Dungeon was more minigame based, and Lavender Island now brings with it an open world environment. There's side missions, tons of different characters to interact with, collectibles, even a day-night cycle. All the stuff you'd see in your usual open world game, with the amount of detail not being skimped on at all, despite the broader environment. The main mechanic of this game revolves around several masks we pick up throughout the game, all having separate functions, as well as the ship we acquire that allows us to fly in the air. there. There's also a character we meet who eventually comes to be known as Boneleg, who in our first mission gives us a psych evaluation, making us fill in the blanks with answers that are predominantly cynical, being sad because no one cares about you, the only people you know being obsessed with money, always liking to test the limits of how bad you can be in a relationship, all concluding in us being diagnosed as a narcissist, or at least that's what happened in my case. Soon after this is where we acquire our first mask, this being one that allows us to shoot out medication like Viagra, with the effects it has on other people, making them blow up in size, not just having their... Anyway, this slant on diagnosing people and promptly putting them on medication making a reappearance from Fuzz Dungeon, and only getting reinforced even further when trying to collect some more pills but being told we don't have insurance.
The group crossed the water with their satchels and built makeshift huts on the beach. As generations passed, the huts became houses, and the houses became buildings, and the buildings became real estate investment portfolios.
Heading into the slums, we can see how Jeremy includes certain design choices within this open world setting that I find to be genuinely impressive. Kind of like in the recent Spider-Man games, we're able to look inside all the windows of the different buildings and oftentimes see a figure on the inside. But as it comes around to nighttime, the windows start lighting up with bright, prominent colours that look fantastic. The critiques on the pharmaceutical industry only appear to continue, however, when getting back on track. Heading into a pharmacy who's run by a so-called vape expert, and giving us some THC extract that we can give to passers-by to let them chill out, I suppose. And soon after that, we end up acquiring our second mask, this being one that allows us to see through pretty much every building in the entire game, with most of these, amazingly, having something strange contained inside. From here, we head to the Clown Crypt renovation zone, first making a stop to Clown Town, which is an area that brings back the more abstract landscapes and individualized challenges, hearing stories about people traveling to alien planets and creating a half-alien sun known as Sprom.
While exploring bachelorhood, Bill impregnated an alien at a sex club and had a half-alien son that he named Sprom.
His favorite thing about Earth was comedy, and Strom desperately wanted to become a comedian. He went to famous venues as much as possible and also participated in an open mic night at a bar by his apartment. He studied the sense of humor of humans intently. It was half in him, but his other half was awkward and from a totally different way of life. Luckily, awkwardness was a current trend in comedy, and eventually, Strom became quite successful. His friend even made a TV show about his struggles in the comedy world. Strom used his royalties from the show to get a ticket back to his home planet, where he thought he would be well received and could share his love of jokes. No one there cared about his adventures in a distant world. It made no sense to them. He had to get a job in a factory making alien technology, and never made enough money to return to Earth, even for his dad's funeral.
It might sound insane, but the overall message speaks to the idea of never being able to fit in, no matter where you go. You feel out of place when going out of your element, and then once you become accustomed to a new environment, you then feel out of place when returning to the one you once knew. We then get my favourite mask in the game, the clown mask, allowing us to dance around whenever we please. Transitioning into the business disintegration district, we quickly acquire another mask, being asked by an artist to collect citizens and make them follow their art accounts on social media. Something else I noted while playing to be another very key talking point that's already been hinted at in Jeremy's last couple games. Having something as pure as your own creative artistry be somewhat tainted due to the overwhelming presence of art that's already in the world. It's never as simple as merely creating a piece of art, putting it out there and reaping the rewards. There's also the promotion side of it, something that I can say from my own own experience can oftentimes feel very disingenuous. It's a certain kind of mentality, admittedly, but one that wholeheartedly resonates with me personally. Others won't mind the idea of putting themselves out there in that kind of way, but there's also the view it's almost like begging for attention, even if what's been created deserves it. We journey underground, destroying cameras and being told a story about a group of anarchists who saved and redeveloped a part of the city, but due to them being on real estate, eventually being trampled on by those higher up than them.
In the empty chain stores that once littered the traffic streets, anarchists opened up community-run schools, experimental art galleries. The mayor hated the community as it was on valuable real estate, and eventually passed legislation to allow the police to run through it, demolish everything, and arrest whomever they like. A fancy new mall stands in its place. It is named Mika Plaza, after the new leader of the anarchist group.
Once again, the immense pursuit of money coming to the forefront. Jeremy appears to utterly despise this kind of exploitation by those who are already rich and powerful, and it doesn't particularly seem like he thinks the vast majority of the rich and powerful are any good either. Finally, we arrive at the Two Butts extraterrestrial colony, finding an alien mask that ends up revealing secret pathways and messages that were previously invisible, mechanically being one of the most impressive tools in the entire game, with the incredibly broad number of messages that we can see, including doing taxes while stoned, love religion, abandoned for drugs, ambient music for fish. Then when back in the city, we're made to make our way onto an elevated platform, where Boneleg can be found cuddling with another version of us, in which we're told another version of us is actually dead, with the second version turning into ashes and fading away. What all this means is anyone's guess. All that came to my mind was some kind of ego death, leaving your past self behind kind of thing. I'll be honest, I really don't know. It would fit into the whole acid trip feel of the game, I suppose. And with us scattering our own ashes, we're given the offer to do some mushrooms with Boneleg in the park, where a nice trip very soon turns into a bad one, getting a final boss against a big robot controlled by the mayor. The ending, however, doesn't appear to be all that positive in my opinion, despite how it initially seems. We rise out of the city, a city that we discover is inside a glass container with a cork holding everyone inside. But upon breaking free, quite literally ascending past everyone else and escaping this sort of rat race, we're greeted by a completely run-down patch of land inside some kind of skeleton. From what the first guy mentions when talking to him, I perceive this to be the state of mind of someone who only focuses on existentialism and what they don't understand compared to focusing on the reality in front of them. It's something that becomes increasingly more common with people at an older age. There's never truly a way to experience everything life has to offer. It's never going to be possible to watch every single video on YouTube that could give some greater insight, or to go to every single place in the world. After a certain point, many people will feel like they've seen enough to know how everything functions. And with that kind of knowledge being acquired, at least to themselves, you oftentimes see them retreat back into their own minds and start reflecting on what all this stuff means. That's one take. Another fairly reasonable take would perhaps be an acknowledgement of abstract art in general. The way this guy describes how there's literally nothing of worth here aside from a fetid, oily swamp, which they in turn try to apply to themselves and understand what it represents in relation to them, instead of merely looking at it for what it is, a mess. That takes us to the end of Lavender Island, and I hope with this video I've not only given a greater insight on Jeremy's work, but also a greater understanding in terms of what can be achieved in the video game format. These types of games are never going to be given huge budgets to work with, and are most likely still going to turn off a lot of people who enjoy video games. But I perceive Jeremy's work as a genuine commodity, a trilogy of games that feels both amateur and unfinished, yet so blatantly intentional and artistic. It's once again about perception. If you're playing a game like God of War and experience clipping issues constantly, yeah, I could see that as is a reasonable complaint considering how realistic the game's trying to be. But when you've got something like Jeremy's games, where everything is so unrealistic, so abstract, I'm left in a position where I can't find much to criticize, outside of perhaps some clunky controls. Again, that's me personally. These games are ones that are going to be a whole lot more polarizing than your standard AAA game that usually plays things incredibly safe. Despite how much I enjoy these games, unlike what I can do with much bigger titles, I can't really justify if another video game player says they're awful. They admittedly include all of the elements to be seen as a bad game, but I simply find the artistic merit to drown out any of those criticisms. I encourage everyone who hasn't played these yet to go and try them out if it looks like something you'd be interested in, as there's many things in these that I guarantee can be perceived in multiple different ways, and other moments of commentary that are conveyed in both a visual and auditory sense that made me stop and think about numerous things. Some of them bad, some of them good, some of them being uncomfortable, but always insightful regardless.